Once I met a girl lost in a book, dreaming the past. Follow, she said, and jumped in a page. She smiled and she asked. Walked to Glenfinnan, waited with Charlie. We drank an old leaf, we were toasted by Robbie. We stood as they signed in our broth at the Abbey. She took me to places that I never thought you could see.
Hi, and welcome to the first of the Independence Live Random Scottish History videos. I felt like because it was February we could maybe discuss love and Scottish courtship and marriage traditions, some of the superstitions that are involved, etc. So we'll get into it. So there were numerous ways in which a girl might divine who her intended future husband was. We have a quote: "A girl had only to agitate the water in a bucket of spring water with her hand, or to throw broken eggs over another person's head, if she wished to see the image of the man she should marry." There were Halloween customs designed to see the face of your intended in buckets of water and in the fireplace and things too. Among the working classes, a proposal was made by the male arranging to meet his sweetheart in the local tavern or bar. The girl, his sweetheart, would know why she was being invited to the bar, so she would dress up to the nines. She would wear her best outfit, and they would have a kind of pantomime conversation along the lines of, "I'm going to speir whether you will tak me, Jenny. 'Deed, Jock, I thought you might hae speered that lang syne. They said that you would refuse me, lassie. Then they're leers, Jock, and so you'll no refuse me, lassie. I've telt you that twice o'er already, Jock." And both parties would then lick the thumb of their right hands and press them together while vowing fidelity to each other. And this act of pressing the moistened thumbs together was a real solemn contract. Breaking this contract amounted to perjury. It was real frowned upon. If you were to break your promise to your intended, that was a serious matter. You had to be sure, before entering into it, I guess. So we actually have a description of this whole practice, including a poem that was taken from the Aberdeen People's Journal for 1899. Instead of telling his whole tale of love to his sweetheart and then applying to her father for his consent to the marriage, the lovesick swain betook himself to an inn or public house, confided his secret to the wife of mine host, and persuaded her to send for the young woman to whom he had lost his heart. The chosen maiden rarely refused to comply with the lover's request, and so, between copious libations of brandy, whisky, and beer, the marriage was amicably arranged. The contracting parties joined the thumbs of their right hands and pressed them together, vowing fidelity the while. The curious custom is celebrated in verse thus: "My sweetest May, let love incline ye, accept a heart which he designs you, and as ye cannot love regret it, sign for its faithfulness receive it. 'Tis proof is shot to birth or money, but yields to what is sweet and bonny. Receive it then wi' a kiss and a smile, aye, there's my thumb, it will ne'er beguile you." Like I said, this was as solemn an oath as one taken in court. It was used for centuries in Scotland for varying contracts. This licking the thumb, and this was a common sign that a contract had been agreed, and it almost validated it and secured it. In later years, instead of the licking the thumb together, they would confirm their contract of marriage by heading to the nearest local stream. They would wash their hands, and then they would clasp hands over the running water. And this is apparently how Burns and his Highland Mary confirmed their betrothal. They did that over the Fale stream of Coilsfield, apparently. So men tended to put off proposing to their sweethearts until they were sure that they had the sufficient means to pay for their new wife and future children, to give them a comfortable life. And there were actually certain occasions where the church authorities would prevent a marriage from taking place purely just due to the fact that the male partner was in debt. So he would be told, sort out your circumstances and then come back and try again, kind of thing. Scottish Highlanders in particular took marriage very seriously. Illicit intercourse before marriage between the sexes was of rare occurrence and met with condign punishment in the public infamy which attended such breaches against chastity. So if you had sex before marriage, your reputation was out the window. The moment anyone heard about it, the moment anyone got wind of that circumstance, you were the gossip of the town. Your reputation was worth nothing, and your hopes of a good future partnership was really brought to naught, as they would say. This was the more remarkable as early marriages were discouraged and the younger sons were not allowed to marry until they obtained sufficient means to keep a house and to rent a small farm, or were otherwise enabled to support a family. So there again we're being told that the man needs to be in a position to be able to marry, to be able to afford what comes with marriage, all the responsibilities that come with that. Prior to the wedding day itself in the Highlands, the marriage invitations were given by the bride and bridegroom in person for some weeks previous and included the respective friends of the betrothed parties living at a distance of many miles. So they would really go on quite the trek in order to make sure their invitations were delivered for their wedding. When the bride and bridegroom had completed their rounds, the custom was for the matrons of the invited families to return the visit within a few days, carrying along with them large presents of hams, beef, cheese, butter, malt, spirits, and such other articles as they inclined or thought necessary for the approaching feast. To such an extent was this practice carried in some instances in the quantity presented, that along with what the guests paid, as they commonly did, for their entertainment at the marriage and the gifts presented on the day after the marriage, the young couple obtained a pretty fair competence which warded off the shafts of poverty and even made them comfortable in afterlife. So your wedding really set you up as well in some cases. So you would make sure that you were provisioned well enough, you had decent employment in order to propose marriage in the first place to your sweetheart. And then all your friends and relatives would donate varying items as well as money itself to the couples in order to get them off to a good start. Prior to getting married, myself, I had no idea of any wedding traditions or superstitions. I'm not a superstitious person. I don't really hold any superstitions at all. But the girl who was planning my wedding, Gillian, she was just fantastic. She had very little time, almost nothing of a budget, and she really went all out for us. When I went on my hen night, I was told that it was a Glasgow custom. I was to bring a potty with me, a child's training toilet with me, for people to put money in return for a kiss from myself, the prospective bride. And I'd never heard of this, and I didn't have such a thing to hand, and I don't know that I knew very many people with new children at that point that would have one to borrow. So I think I just went out with a bag for life bag, and we did it that way. And yeah, walked away from my hen night with a couple £100, which was nice. But that was a custom that I had no idea about, and seems particular to Glasgow. But you guys can let me know if you've heard of that, or if maybe that occurs elsewhere in Scotland. Coming on to marriage itself, the legal age of marriage in Scotland is 16, so 2 years before you're legally able to drink. But that wasn't always the case. We have a quote here. The age of 12 in the case of females and 14 in that of males had thus been fixed as the period of capacity for marriage, an age which, to say the least, was rather ludicrous when one recollected that it corresponded with the age made compulsory for attendance at school. At such an early age, indeed at any age below that of majority, 21, neither one's physical nor intellectual development could be complete, yet in the case of marriage, the most important thing which any man or woman could possibly undertake, the law permitted minors who were not fully alive to the serious nature of their undertaking, or who in popular language didn't know their own minds, to marry without any restriction. So this seems to have been the case in Scotland up to the end of the 16th century-ish. But I don't believe it was something that was done often. Children getting married at a young age in history tended to be those of the upper classes, those who had a stake in uniting families, royalty, etc. But what you'll read when coming across those instances is that they may have been married at a very young age, but they didn't live together as a married couple until they were older. So while the marriage contract was fulfilled at a very young age, it wasn't as if these children were setting up home and doing as adults did. They were kept fairly separate until they were old enough to do that. So we have another quote regarding this. The first book of discipline required that persons purposing marriage be of a certain age, the man 14 years and the woman 12 years at least. Rather an unnecessary stipulation, one would be inclined to think, had we not cases on record of kirk sessions being compelled to stay proceedings until this condition was fulfilled. A case of this kind arose in St Andrews in 1568, when the superintendent of Fife inhibited solemnisation of marriage until the man was 14 of age complete, he having confessed to be but 13 years of age at St. Lawrence Day last bypast. Another requirement was, as we have seen, the consent of parents or curators. So what's called here as a curious custom prevailed in Scotland for long. Hand-fasting, or a man and woman engaging to live together for the period of a year and being held free at its expiry, if they pleased. This custom prevailed among high and low and received its death blow at the Reformation. At first an acknowledgment by parties of being husband and wife, made either by word or writing and followed by living together, was held as a valid marriage, but the General Assembly ruled in 1563 that no contract of marriage made secretly should be recognised till the offender submitted to discipline and the contract be verified. I've been to hand-fasting when I lived at Faslane Peace Camp. Sai and Freya were hand-fasted in a really beautiful ceremony. There was a big bonfire and there was fire twirling, and we did it at night in the woods across the road from the Peace Camp, and it was just really beautiful. They had their hands tied together, so right hands are tied, and you solemnize the wedding or end the hand fasting by the couple jumping over a fire or over cross swords. I think they did it over fire, although we had the option of both. I think I remember them choosing to jump over the fire. together. That made for an interesting experience. So apparently there were 3 stages to getting married previously. We have here, there were in the olden times 3 distinct stages in the career of Hymen's devotees: contracted, orderly proclaimed, and married. The word contracted refers to hand fasting, a ceremony of pre-Reformation times in which parties purposing marriage appeared before the priest and one or more witnesses and, joining hands in their presence, pledged themselves to one another. To this day we talk of bestowing one's hand in marriage. This ancient custom, or something closely akin to it, continued to prevail in the early Reformed Church. In too many cases the mere betrothal was looked upon by the parties as an actual marriage, and in 1575, 15 years after the Reformation, the General Assembly evidently desired to put a stop to this evil. It was then declared that all that was necessary with a view to marriage was that parties should give in their names that their banns may be proclaimed. So that was announcing your intention to marry, so that others who might be against that union have time to come forward and plead their case against the union. The time of the event was a most important consideration, and then as now there was a common aversion to May weddings. The notion of ill luck originated with the Romans and caused every other rite or religious service to cease for the nonce, so that those who elected to marry during that period were supposed to arouse the fury of the fates. June was the month which the Romans considered the most propitious season of the year for contracting matrimonial engagements, especially if the day chosen were that of the full moon or the conjunction of the sun and moon. The month of May was especially to be avoided, as under the influence of spirits adverse to happy households. It was also considered that a union could never be happy if the bridal party in going to church met a monk, a priest, a hare, a dog, a cat, lizard, or serpent, while all would go well if it were a wolf, a spider, or a toad. Nor was it an unimportant matter to choose the wedding day carefully. The feast of St. Joseph, the 19th of March, was especially to be avoided, and it is supposed that as this day fell in mid-Lent, it was the reason why all the councils and synods of the Church forbade marriage during that season of fasting. Indeed, all penitential days and vigils throughout the year were considered unsuitable for these joyous ceremonies. It was also the custom of the early Church to hold the weddings on the Sunday itself, within the church after Mass had been held. In 1571 it was declared by the General Assembly that, banns being 3 several Sundays lawfully proclaim it, the marriage may be any day of the week solemnize it, the only requirement being that an sufficient number and witnesses be present. For long, however, the custom prevailed of marrying either on the Sunday or on the day on which the weekly sermon, an institution in vogue in those days, was held. It was not until towards the close of the 17th century that this latter custom began to be disregarded. Marriage in private, by which we mean in the house of one of the parties, so common throughout Scotland in the present day, seems to have crept in about the same time. A woman would also be given to her husband along with a tocher, which was a Scottish form of a dowry. This was obviously practiced more by families who could afford to do so, and it was felt like the woman would be less likely to have to accept whoever came along asking her hand in marriage if she had a tocher, because then she would have the leisure of allowing the husband to be worthy of her and her tocher, you know. So if the woman came along with land and property, then the man would want to feel like he was in a position worthy of accepting that land and property. It was less likely that random chancers were going to come out the woodwork to try and obtain that. Clergymen could also refuse to marry a couple if they were unable to recite the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the Ten Commandments. So you would find that couples who were about to be married would suddenly become very religious. They would take to studying these three things in order to know them by rote. This did start to become a thing of the past towards the end of the 18th century. One extract from the St Andrews records bearing on this point may be of interest. It is of date 1597. William Brown and Marion Pride are contracted in marriage. William can not to rehearse the commandis. To rehearse the same before marriage, 30 shillings paid, because they could not to rehearse the commandamentus. So there we go. 30 shillings, that's a lot of money. Also, 40 days were to be kept between the proclamation of the banns and the wedding itself. But there isn't really any reason given for this. I think it mainly is to give varying other parties time to make their way to where the marriage will be held in order to make a protest against it, either because they're already contracted to be married to the person whose banns has been read, maybe someone is in breach of a promise or what have you, but I can only think that's the reason. So married parties in Rutherglen up until about 1850 would actually get married without a banns, and their custom seemed to have become getting married without the banns, going to the procurator fiscal or the authority who had jurisdiction over such things, giving them the 5 shillings for having gotten married without a banns having been proclaimed, and on getting the receipt for the 5 shillings, that was then taken as the confirmation of marriage. So and it was declared legal at that point. So yeah, Rutherglen was strange in that respect. The parties contracted. The next step was the proclamation of the banns, like we've discussed. Between the two stages, a considerable time occasionally elapsed, sometimes 6 or 7 years. The practice of crying out in one day is a thing of the end of last, or in many parishes of the beginning of this, the 19th century. But in olden times, the law of the Church explicitly required proclamation on 3 several Lord's days. This is what is implied in the term orderly proclamation. We heard that before, 3 several Sundays. Several in this instance just means individual, 3 individual Sundays. Though of comparatively rare occurrence in our day, it was no uncommon thing in the olden times for proclamations of marriage to be sisted or objected to, the objection generally resting on the plea that the consent of the parents had not been obtained, or that one of the parties had previously bestowed his or her affections on the complainer. This is the instance I speak of when someone has already been promised in marriage, then finds out that their betrothed is about to marry another, and they can be done for breach of promise, and they can halt that proposed marriage taking place. At least put a roadblock in the way of it. In Shetland, after the marriage day had been fixed, the parties are cried, as proclamation of banns is termed there, on the Sunday preceding the wedding. On Monday, the young couple go together to invite their friends to the marriage for the following Thursday, that being the invariable bridal day in Shetland. If well-to-do people, they mention the wedding was free, but if nothing was said beyond the invitations being given, then it was understood each young man was to bring a bottle of whisky with him to assist at the festivities. On the morning of the wedding in Scotland generally, the bride is attended by her bridesmaids or attendant, and her feet are washed. Previous to the auspicious day, the bride lived in a state of semi-seclusion and refrained from attendance at church until such time as she had changed her name. On the eve of the wedding, her presents, outfit and providing were conveyed to her new home under the direction of the best maid, who was careful to carry in first thing a quantity of salt and sprinkle it on the floor as a protection against an evil eye. The house set in order, she returned to the bride's parental abode, and along with a number of companies proceeded to wash the bride's feet. This act was considered a survival of an old Scandinavian rite, by means of which the bride was compelled to undergo a bath as a sort of religious purification. The bridegroom, too, had to undergo a similar ordeal at the hands of his friends. Again, up in Shetland, the guests assembled at the bride's home for breakfast, and that being concluded, the young woman proceeded to dress for the occasion. Most were dressed in dark stuff dresses, spotlessly white stockings and low shoes, but all, without exception, the bride included, wore white muslin caps trimmed with bows of narrow, bright ribbons. The taste of the various wearers was displayed in the making and trimming of these caps. They were made up on a stiff frame, not unlike the bonnet frames of our days. Some made them neatly and simply with bows of bright ribbon of one colour, and most becoming headdresses they were. Only one married couple were permitted to accompany the party to church. The married couple, as they are called, are generally old friends of the families about to be united, the bride choosing the married woman, the bridegroom the married man. This custom is probably one of great antiquity, as we find that as early as the 9th century it was customary for a bride to be accompanied by a matron called the brideswoman, and followed by maidens called her bridesmaids. The bridegroom's man was termed the forewestman or foremost man, whose duty it was to see all the arrangements carried out properly. In Shetland, the bride does not choose her bridesmaid from among her own friends, but must have the bridegroom's eldest unmarried sister, and the bridegroom must return the compliment by having for his best man her eldest unmarried brother. At a Shetland wedding there is always an equal number of lads and lasses. The only odd one is a man termed the gunner, who, with gun in hand, precedes the company, firing every few minutes, the men shouting when he fires. Church having been reached at noon, that being the invariable hour for church weddings there, the ceremony was proceeded with in the usual way, and very speedily the party emerged once more into the open air. The newly married pair headed the procession towards the bride's house, preceded as before by the gunner, and followed by the married couple, and the best man and best maid, the rest following in the same order as they came. In the Highlands, however, the joyous wedding morning was ushered in by the notes of the bagpipe. A party of pipers, followed by the bridegroom and a party of his friends, commenced at an early hour a round of morning calls to remind the guests of their engagements. These hastened to join the party, and before the circuit, which sometimes occupied several hours, had ended, some hundreds, perhaps, had joined the wedding standard before they reached the bridegroom's house. The bride made a similar round among her friends. Separate dinners were provided, the bridegroom giving a dinner to his friends and the bride to hers. The marriage ceremony was seldom performed till after dinner. The clergyman sometimes attended, but the parties preferred waiting on him, as the appearance of a large procession to his house gave additional importance and eclat to the ceremony of the day, which was further heightened by a constant firing by the young men, who supplied themselves with guns and pistols, and which firing was responded to by every hamlet as the party passed along, so that with streamers flying, pipers playing, the constant firing from all sides, and the shouts of the young men, the whole had the appearance of a military army passing, with all the noise of warfare through a hostile country. I quite like that as a way of starting your wedding day. That seems like it bodes well for a good party afterwards. So it's actually always been the way of things that the bride would wear white to her wedding. From the earliest times in Scotland, that was the way of it. 3 ornaments were worn by her on her way to the altar. These were the ring on her finger, the brooch on her breast, and the garland on her head. The first being typical of the endlessness of matrimonial love, the brooch signifying maidenly innocence, while the garland was the reward accorded to her for having successfully resisted the temptations to evil that had beset her course from childhood to matrimony. No widow on her remarriage might wear a garland, nor could any bride whose reputation had suffered from her own lightness of conduct. The garlands were mostly composed of roses and myrtle, and the hair was generally worn in loose tresses to the altar in token of her freedom, but on laying aside her virgin crown, the newly made bride bound up her hair, significant of her subjection to a husband. How the ring came to be used is not well ascertained. As in former days, it did not occupy its present prominent position, but it was given with other presents to mark the completion of a contract. Its form is intended as a symbol of eternity and of the intention of both parties to keep forever the solemn covenant into which they have entered before God, and of which it is a pledge. Again, in the Highlands, on the wedding day, the bride and bridegroom avoided each other till they met before the clergyman. Many ceremonies were performed during the celebration of the marriage rites. These ceremonies were of an amusing and innocent description, and added much to the cheerfulness and happiness of the young people. One of these ceremonies consisted in untying all the bindings and strings about the person of the bridegroom, to denote that nothing was to be bound on the marriage day but the one indissoluble knot, which death only can dissolve. The bride was exempted from this operation from a delicacy of feeling towards her sex, and from a supposition that she was so pure that infidelity on her part could not be contemplated. We divide marriages into regular and irregular, of which the first take place after the proclamation of bans in the parish church, some religious ceremony being performed by a clergyman, or, if the two parties to it prefer, they declare themselves married in the presence of a clergyman, either in church or in a private house. In irregular marriages, it is sufficient for a man to point to a woman and say in the presence of two witnesses, "This is my wife." By an act passed in the time of Charles II, persons marrying in a clandestine, inorderly way, or by persons not authorised by the Kirk, rendered themselves liable to imprisonment for 3 months and the infliction of a fine. The Church contented itself with rebuking the parties for their irregular conduct, followed by the exaction of a fine for the benefit of the poor. We need not remind any Scotchman that Burns was married, but it may be a surprise to some to learn that the marriage was an irregular one, and Dr. Edgar gives us the minute of the Kirk session of Mauchline recording the appearance of the poet and his bonny Jean before them. It is dated the 5th of August, 1788. Compeered Robert Burns with Jean Armour, his alleged spouse. They both acknowledged their irregular marriage, and their sorrow for that irregularity, and desiring that the session may take such steps as may seem to them proper, in order to the solemn confirmation of the said marriage. The session, taking this affair under their consideration, agree that they both be rebuked for this alleged irregularity, and that they be taken solemnly engaged to adhere faithfully to one another as husband and wife all the days of their life. In regard the session have a title in law to some time for behoof of the poor, they refer to Mr. Burns his own generosity. The above sentence was accordingly executed, and the session absolved the said parties from any scandal on that account. Signed Robert Burns, Jean Armour, and William Auld, the moderator, and it's noted that Mr. Burns gave a guinea note for behoof of the poor. Marriage being more of a civil contract in Scotland, and therefore easier to procure, it meant that those in England looking to elope or get married in an easier fashion or at a younger age would come up to Gretna Green, come up to the borders, and Gretna Green was the town chosen by the majority to get married. So Robert Elliot, the last of the so-called border priests, published a book called The Gretna Green Memoirs, in which he says that between 1811 and 1839, no fewer than 7,744 persons were married by his certificate. Owing to the grave irregularities, border marriages were suppressed by Parliament in 1856. So this 1856 Act declared that no irregular marriage was valid unless one of the parties had lived in Scotland for a period of 21 days preceding it, and as their English friends came hither in hot haste to get united, this enactment effectually put a stop to their haste and an end to Gretna Green marriages. Chambers' Book of Days actually tells us that the marriage service as it was in the 19th century differed very little from that used by their forefathers. He says a few obsolete words only being changed. The bride was taken for fairer, for fouler, for better, for worse, and promised to be buxom and bonny to her future husband. The bridegroom put the ring on each of the bride's left-hand fingers in turn, saying at the first, in the name of the Father, at the second, in the name of the Son, at the third, in the name of the Holy Ghost, and at the fourth, Amen. The father presented his son-in-law with one of his daughter's shoes as a token of the transfer of authority, and the bride was made to feel the change by a blow on her head given with the shoe. The husband was bound by oath to use his wife well, in failure of which she might leave him, yet as a point of honour he was allowed to bestow on his wife and apprentices moderate castigation. So, no. After the wedding, the bride would walk around the circumference of the church grounds without her husband. I think in some places it was around the inside of the church, just a final walk alone around this sanctified place, I guess. Towards the end of the 18th century, Highland brides would walk around those who had gathered, giving them each a kiss. A collection was taken from the people who had gathered to witness the wedding, and it was given to the new bride in order for her to procure household necessities and things for her new home. So we have the ceremony accomplished. There was a general rush amongst the young men to snatch the first kiss from the blushing bride. Usually, however, they were outwitted by the minister, who exacted it as his fee. On the return journey, a keenly contested race known as running the brews or braes or brew was started by the young men. He who first arrived at the young couple's house was presented with a bottle of whisky and a glass, and thus armed, he returned to meet the party and distribute his prize. The winning of the race was esteemed a great honour, and farmers' sons, eager for the coveted distinction, would even borrow racing horses for the occasion. In some parts of the country, the bride was lifted over the threshold or first step for fear of witchcraft or an ill being cast on her. So that's where that superstition comes from, of carrying your new bride over the threshold. The wedding feast was held in the nave of the church, sometimes where the ceremony had been performed. Thereafter, the wedding procession would accompany the couple to their new marital home, where they'd maybe make toasts and have the speeches and a wee bit of a party. The guests would then leave, with the exception of the bridesmaids and groomsmen, whose job it then was to undress them and put them to bed, preparatory to the arrival of the priest, whose duty it was to bless the bed and its occupants, while the acolytes, waving to and fro their burning censers, fumigated the room with hallowing incense. These ceremonies being completed, the happy couple were left to their own reflections and the enjoyment of each other's society. That seems strange to me, but it was the way of things. So on entering her new home, I guess after having been carried over the threshold, the new bride would have something called an infor cake, a kind of shortbread broken over her head. And we have a quote telling us about this. Inside the door, the bridegroom's mother broke a specially prepared cake of bread over her daughter-in-law's head, and thereafter presented her with the poker, tongs, and broom as symbols of her office. Later on, the keys of the house were handed her, and thus she was established mistress in her new home. The remnants of the cake, the predecessor of our more elegant bride's cake, were distributed amongst the young women and girls, and then feasting and dancing set a period to the day's festivities. We see videos coming out of the US a lot, of people getting married and then the bride's face is pushed into her wedding cake, and I'm wondering if maybe the custom of breaking the cake, the shortbread over the head, lent itself to that at all. I'm not sure. I think I would have been sad to have had my face pushed into my wedding cake, but it was a particularly good wedding cake. So in Shetland, the same kind of custom was observed, with a wee bit more of a party ensuing. On nearing the house, they were met by the bride's parents and a number of other married guests who congratulated the young couple, and just as the bride crossed the threshold, her mother broke the bride's cake over her head, and all present partook of it and drank health and happiness to the newly married pair. Dinner of a most substantial kind followed, consisting of broth, mutton, geese, fowls all boiled, with plates of bread and butter all dotted over the table, whisky going its round between courses. After ample justice had been done to this meal, all proceeded to an adjoining barn, where the squeak of a fiddle preparing for work was heard, and there dancing was carried on vigorously, old and young alike joining in the pastime. The intricate-looking Shetland reel, which is danced by 3 couples, was the only dance, set after set occupying the floor in rapid succession. After some hours had been spent in this way, tea was partaken of, after which dancing was resumed and kept up till supper was served about 12 o'clock. This meal was a repetition of dinner, excepting that broth was not presented again, but the hard exercise they had been engaged in had made all quite ready to enjoy a very substantial repast. Though whisky again made its rounds as at dinner, it was taken in such moderation that none were the worse of it, and indeed it was and is a rare sight to see any tipsy on such occasions. After supper, dancing was kept up till between 3 and 4 o'clock, when all being worn out and the night dark and stormy, the floor of the barn where the dancing had been carried on was strewn with straw, and the whole company, with the exception of the newly married couple, who had retired some time previously, lay down and were speedily in the land of dreams. Often, however, in those days, they were kept up all Friday and Saturday, and on Sunday, as many of the guests lived in the neighbourhood, accompanied the young couple to church to be kirkened, as it is termed there. This fashion of wedding guests formed a procession on Kirkening Sunday, and going to church with the newly married pair, though obsolete here, is still kept up in some of the islands. The festivities of the wedding day in the Scottish Highlands was generally prolonged to a late hour, and during the whole day the fiddlers and pipers never ceased, except at short intervals, to make sweet music. The fiddlers performed in the house, the pipers in the field, so that the company alternately enjoyed the pleasure of dancing within and without the house, as inclined, provided the weather permitted. We're told by General Stewart that playing the bagpipes within doors is a Lowland and English custom. In the Highlands, the piper is always in the open air, and when people wish to dance to his music, it is on the green, if the weather permits. Nothing but necessity makes them attempt a pipe dance in the house. The bagpipe was a field instrument intended to call the clans to arms and animate them in battle, and was no more intended for a house than a round of 6-pounders. By 6-pounders I assume he means cannonry. A curious custom in connection with marriage prevailed at one time in Scotland, and, from the manner in which it was carried out, was called creeling the bridegroom. The mode of procedure in the village of Galashiels was as follows. Early in the day after the marriage, those interested in the proceeding assembled at the house of the newly wedded couple, bringing with them a creel or basket, which they filled with stones. The young husband, on being brought to the door, had the creel firmly fixed upon his back, and with it in this position had to run the round of the town, or at least the chief portion of it, followed by a number of men to see that he did not drop his burden, the only condition on which he was allowed to do so being that his wife should come after him and kiss him. As relief depended altogether upon the wife, it would sometimes happen that the husband did not need to run more than a few yards, but when she was more than ordinarily bashful, or wished to have a little sport at the expense of her lord and master, which it may be supposed would not unfrequently be the case, he had to carry his load a considerable distance. This custom was very strictly enforced, for the person who was last creeled had charge of the ceremony, and he was naturally anxious that no one should escape. The practice, as far as Galashiels was concerned, came to an end about 60 years ago, about 1825-ish, in the person of one Robert Young, who, on the ostensible plea of a sore back, lay abed all the day after his marriage and obstinately refused to get up and be creeled. He had been twice married before, and no doubt felt that he had had enough of creeling. So that is an interesting custom that we should definitely bring back. I'm on board with that one. So the bride herself, she would have a slight change in clothing post-marriage. The snood was the badge of virginity, and that was discarded by the bride on the evening of her wedding day, and the following morning some of her married neighbours entered the house and crowned her head with the kirch, or close cap, in token of her wedded state. One of the new wife's first household jobs was, surprisingly, to prepare for her and her family's deaths. Getting married would be followed sometimes fairly shortly after by pregnancy and childbirth, and women were under no illusions at this point. Their lives were in danger every time they gave birth to a child, and they were fairly pragmatic about it, and preparations were made. Wills would be written by women who were confined, or in confinement as it was called, in the few days leading up to the birth of the child. We have a quote regarding this. The first duty which devolved on an ident bride was the spinning of linen anent the day of her death. Dr. Jameson writes, and I believe it's the same Dr. Jameson as wrote the Dictionary of the Scots Language, when a woman of the lower class in Scotland, however poor, or whether married or single, commences housekeeping, her first care, after what is absolutely necessary for the time, is to provide death linen for herself and those who look to her for that office, being her dependents. Captain Burt, in his Highland Letters, refers to the fact that soon after the wedding day, the newly married wife sets herself about spinning her winding sheet, and a husband that shall steal or pawn it is esteemed among men most profligate. Another writer of more recent years states that a similar practice prevailed in his youth, and that these garments were periodically brought from their seclusion and spread before the fire to air. On such occasions mirth and jollity were banished, and the day was kept as solemnly as the Sabbath. I like that on being made, these, basically just a sheet, was suddenly very precious. We're being told that they're brought out on a regular basis to be aired and to be kept good, and that if a husband were to pawn such an item, he would just be the worst of people. Yeah, it was a special item that the woman made. So I quite like that. Divorce. As mentioned previously, with regards English couples coming up to Scotland because getting married was just a slightly easier prospect, divorce was also an easier prospect due to the view taken of marriage in Scotland, of it being a civil contract, not unlike any other business or formal contract, where both parties agree to the contract, and with the agreement of both, the contract can be dissolved and ended. So we're told that in Scotland the law concerning marriage has been of a very different character. This Presbyterian country has regarded marriage according to the scriptures as essentially a civil contract. No court of law in England could dissolve a marriage. That required the interposition of Parliament, and accordingly was a step never resorted to except by those in high degree. The law of England viewed marriage as a contract too solemn to be dissolved. high degree. The law of England viewed marriage as a contract too solemn to be dissolved by any court of the realm. It was also an expensive process to go through, which is probably what they mean by only those in high degree could obtain a divorce. We're also told that with us, Scots, marriage is not only an entirely civil contract, but may be entered into with the same freedom as any other contract which requires nothing but mutual consent, and by the same standard it can be ended by that mutual consent. Under the Married Women's Property Act of 1881, it was shown that the right by which the husband formerly acquired through his marriage the personal property of his wife, this had been abolished altogether, and such property vested in the wife herself. Marriage was also dissolved in two ways, by death and divorce, that the latter was only granted on two grounds: adultery and wilful desertion for 4 years, and that the effect thereof was to leave the parties at liberty to marry again. In the Scottish Highlands, divorce was not commonly resorted to. No people were more attached to the fulfilment of all the domestic duties and the sacred obligation of the marriage vow than the Highlanders. A violation thereof was, of course, of unfrequent occurrence, and among the common people a separation was almost unknown. Rarely, indeed, did a husband attempt to get rid of his wife, however disagreeable she might be. He would have considered his children dishonoured if he had driven their mother from the protection of his roof. The punishment inflicted by the ecclesiastical authority for an infringement of the marriage vow was that the guilty person, whether male or female, was made to stand in a barrel of cold water at the church door, after which the delinquent, clad in a wet canvas shirt, was made to stand before the congregation, and at close of service the minister explained the nature of the offence. So that was a real public shaming you got there in the Highlands. It was taken very seriously, the whole institution of marriage, as we've seen. A couple of years ago, I made up a Pride in Scottish History post, which tried to glean as much information about homosexual relationships, same-sex relationships throughout history, how it was perceived, how it was punished, etc. And I actually found very few instances from Scotland. I'll leave a link below to it. But same-sex relationships were legalised in Section 80 of the Criminal Justice for Scotland Act in 1980, to be enacted from the 1st of February 1981. And after the millennium, a whole slew of rights and amendments were enacted to protect those in the LGBTQ+ community. In 2004, we had the Gender Recognition Act. In 2005, civil partnerships were made available. 2009, adoption and parental rights were given. 2010, protection from discrimination was enacted. 2014, same-sex marriages were made available. In 2018, the age was reduced to 16 for the ability to have an X sex descriptor on ID documents and for transition. And in June of 2018, the Scottish Parliament passed the Historical Sexual Offences Act of 2018, pardoning those who had formerly been legislated against for loving who they loved. So that all looks very positive for Scotland in terms of legislation around sex and love and marriage. It's just a shame that it wasn't always better for same-sex couples in order for them to take part in our history, for me to be able to relate about customs and traditions that may have been slightly different for same-sex partners in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Were it legal for them to have those relationships? Women could live together under the term companionship. It wasn't frowned upon at all for women to live together. It wasn't really frowned upon for men to live together, though they had a harder time, I think, averting suspicion from themselves. The men that enacted the laws, I don't think they could contemplate the idea that women could be attracted to each other, for there to be laws enacted against that. But certainly sodomy was the law that was used to target men who loved each other. So I thought I would end with a song I found in the Edinburgh Evening News of 1899, and it's on the theme of how very easy it was apparently to find yourself married in Scotland if you weren't privy to the ways of the Scots, I guess. It's a song warning tourists of how to avoid getting married in Scotland should you not wish to do so. I don't know the tune to which it went, and I don't know that I would attempt to sing it if I did. So I shall read it like a poem. Ye tourists who Scotland would enter, the summer or autumn to pass, I'll tell you how far you may venture to flirt with your lad or your lass, how close you may come upon marriage, still keeping the wind of the law, and not by some foolish miscarriage get wooed and married and a'. Wooed and married and a', married and wooed and a', not by some foolish miscarriage get wooed and married and a'. The maxim itself might content you, that marriage is made by consent, provided it's done de presente, and marriage is really what's meant. Suppose that young Jockey or Jenny say, we two are husband and wife. The witnesses needn't be many, they're instantly buckled for life. Wooed and married and a', married and wooed and a', it isn't with us a hard thing to get wooed and married and a'. Suppose the man only has spoken, the woman just giving a nod. They're spliced by that very same token till one of them's under the sod. Though words would be bolder and blunter, the want of them isn't a flaw, for nutus ignisque loquuntur is good consistorial law. Wooed and married and a', married and wooed and a', a wink is as good as a word to get wooed and married and a'. If people are drunk or delirious, the marriage of course will be bad, or if they're not sober and serious, but acting a play or charade, it's bad if it's only a cover for cloaking a scandal or sin, and talking a landlady over to let the folks lodge in her inn. Wooed and married and a', married and wooed and a', it isn't the mere use of words makes you wooed and married and a'. You'd better keep clear of love letters, or write them with caution and care, for faith they may fasten your fetters if wearing a conjugal air. Unless you're a knowing old stager, 'tis here you'll most likely be lost, as a certain much talked about major had very near found to his cost. Wooed and married and a', married and wooed and a', they are perilous things, pen and ink, to get wooed and married and a'. I ought now to tell the unwary that into the noose they'll be led, by giving a promise to marry, and acting as if they were wed. But if, when the promise you're plighting, to keep it you think you'd be loth, just see that it isn't in writing, and then it must come to your oath. Wooed and married and a', married and wooed and a', I've shown you a dodge to avoid, being wooed and married and a'. A third way of tying the tether, which sometimes may happen to suit, is living a good while together, and getting a married repute. But you, who are here as a stranger, and don't mean to stay with us long, are little exposed to that danger, so here I may finish my song. Wooed and married and a', married and wooed and a', you're taught now to seek or to shun, being wooed and married and a'. And so ends the first of Random Scottish History's Independence Live videos on love and courtship and marriage in Scotland. And we may see you for the next one.